You'll learn how she discovered growth mindset, and you will learn how others have taken that discovery and expanded upon it, and especially its application in and out of the classroom. To start off our discussion about growth mindset, however, we need to define what a mindset is. I think most of us think we know what a mindset is. We think, oh, it's kind of a mental stance where we are positive or we are negative or we believe something or we don't believe something. But a mindset actually has a very specific definition. And here I'm referring to the definition provided by Dr. Ali Crum. Ali Crum is also a professor of psychology at Stanford. She runs her own laboratory working on stress-related mindsets and other mindsets. She's actually been a guest on this podcast previously. Highly recommend you listen to that episode if you haven't already. Dr. Crum defines a mindset as, quote, a mental frame or lens that selectively organizes and encodes information. And I think the key thing to highlight there is organizes information. Because as you all well know, we are constantly being bombarded with information from the outside world. Sensory information about what's going on with our visual system, what we're hearing, is, quote, a mental frame or lens that selectively organizes and encodes information. And I think the key thing to highlight there is organizes information. Because as you all well know, we are constantly being bombarded with information from the outside world. Sensory information about what's going on with our visual system, what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what we're feeling. We are also bombarded with internal sensations of how full or empty our gut feels. Are we hungry? Are we tired? Are we anxious? Are we calm? Etc. So tons and tons of information funneling into our brain, and mindsets really help us organize that information such that we pay attention to certain things and not others, and we respond to certain things and not others. Okay, so here I'm not trying to put additional language on something simple in order to make it complex. I'm trying to put a little bit of language, that is that a mindset does many things, but it mainly organizes information. I'll add to that 4 specific actions or inactions in a way that allows us to simplify our world, in a way that allows us to make certain choices and do away with thinking about and acting on other types of information. The other thing about mindsets is that they include entire narratives. And most of the time, we aren't even aware of how those narratives are operating. Meaning, we don't walk around looking at opportunities in the world, like the opportunity to get better at fitness or a sport or music or arithmetic or languages or anything for that matter, thinking, okay, what is my mental frame or lens that selectively organizes and encodes information? We don't do that. Instead, what we have are stories. And those stories are usually attached to our sense of identity. Like, I'll just use myself, for instance. I do not think of myself as a good musician. In fact, I can't read music. I'm terrible at playing instruments. I like listening to music, but I consider myself a terrible musician, right? I've really assigned a value, or I've assigned my value to music and my relationship to music, right? We tend to do that. We can also do it in the opposite direction, right? I've run a laboratory for a long time. I'm in science for close to 3 decades. So if you ask me, do I feel proficient at science? I'd say, yeah, I'm proficient at science. I know how to do experiments, set up experiments, write research papers, write grants, etc. I'm pretty good at it, right? We tend to decide if we are good or bad at things, and we tend to integrate those with our identity somewhat or a lot, depending on whether or not we're a professional or amateur, how much we engage in an activity. The point being that mindsets include all of these narratives, and often those narratives are visible to us if we think about them, but most of the time we are moving through the world, meaning school, work, relationships, and all our endeavors without a lot of careful thought about the narratives we carry. And the beauty of growth mindset is that it forces us to step back and ask ourselves some simple questions. These are questions that you could ask yourself right now, and in fact, I highly recommend you do. You could ask yourself, for instance, what have I been told I'm really good at? You should also ask yourself, what have I been told I'm really poor at, that I'm just not good at? What have I told myself I'm really good at? And what have I told myself I'm really bad at? And then a second set of questions is, what am I good at and why? Did it come naturally to me? Did I apply myself for many years? Meaning, did I apply a lot of effort to learning that thing? Or perhaps both, right? And then it's also important to ask yourself, why am I not good at other things? Is it simply because you've never applied yourself at those things? Or is it because you tried and had an early failure? Or perhaps you tried and tried and tried for many years and you continued to fail at that thing, or you just didn't reach a level of proficiency that made you want to pursue it further. In asking yourselves those questions, you are asking yourself not just what you're good at and bad at and why. You should also be thinking about where the messages of being good at something or being bad at something arrive from. Did they arrive from outside, from your parents, from your coaches, from your teachers? Or was it the case that despite a lot of positive feedback, you just sort of decided you weren't good at something? Or conversely, was it the case that despite a lot of negative feedback that you would never be good at something, or that you weren't good at something, that you continue to persist? Because there are certainly people like that. The more negative feedback they get, the more they dig their heels in to prove themselves as capable of becoming good at something. So I do recommend, as we march forward in this conversation, you think about those questions. What am I good at? What am I bad at? Why am I good at those things? Why am I bad at those things? And ask yourself to what extent your labels, that is your identity, is attached to the things that you are good at or bad at. And the reason I'd like you to ask yourself those questions is that next we're going to talk about some research from Dr. Carol Dweck's laboratory that was really the seed of the entire field of growth mindset. It relates to a specific set of experiments that really show that the specific feedback we get, meaning whether or not we get feedback that is attached to our identity, smart, or great athlete, or talented, sends us down a very different path short and long term, as compared to whether or not we receive feedback based on effort. Meaning
One
you
enemy
tried really
remaining.
hard, or you really seem to
Spike
apply
down
yourself
A.
in conditions where you're getting the
Last
right answer
player
every time
standing.
because you simply refuse to quit. Those are two very divergent sets of feedback. And as you'll learn in a moment, sorts of feedback that we get, especially early in life or early in an endeavor. So this doesn't just apply to young kids, this applies to adults too, who are taking on a new skill or trying to expand on an existing skill. Those two divergent forms of feedback get integrated into our core beliefs about what we think is possible.
Spike
for us.
planted.
And the great news is we can also modify those beliefs by changing the feedback that we give ourselves. The research paper I'd like to discuss briefly that beautifully embodies the runway that led to the study of growth mindset is a paper from Dr. Carol Dweck as well as her colleague Claudia Mueller. And the title of the paper essentially says it all. The title is Praise for Intelligence Can Undermine Children's Motivation for Performance. That should be surprising. That praise for intelligence can undermine motivation. I would have thought, and I think many of you do, that tell a child or an adult that they're really good at something, and you're genuine about that feedback, or they're performing well, and you're doing really well, you're so smart, you're so talented, that their performance would continue to improve, that it would bolster their motivation to engage in that activity, which hopefully they enjoy. But regardless, provided that it's a safe activity, it's educational, what have you, that it would serve to encourage them. Right? The kid thinks, not only am I engaging in this activity, but I'm getting positive feedback, presumably from people I care about or whose opinion I care about, may that serve to elevate performance. It does not. In fact, the exact opposite happens. So I'll just give you a few of the key takeaways from this study. The way it was done is very interesting. They essentially gave feedback about performance that was linked up with a child's intelligence. Telling kids they're smart, they're talented, that they can learn things early, that they're good at learning, this sort of thing. And they called that intelligence feedback. Or they gave them what was called effort feedback. Simple way to think about effort feedback is that it's more attached to verbs. So effort feedback is something you tried really hard on that. It was great the way that you tried. It was great the way you persisted. It was great the way that even when you got the wrong answer, you spent 10 minutes thinking about it and then you tried again and again. Or in some cases, even if they didn't get the right answer, telling them, well, even though you didn't get the right answer, it's really terrific that you continue to try. Okay, so intelligence feedback was the sort of feedback that was tied to labels of identity, like smart, talented, etc. Whereas effort feedback was tied to verbs, choices, behavioral and cognitive choices that children made in an effort to learn to get better at something. So in this study, which included over 100 children, they either got the intelligence type feedback or the effort type feedback, or there was a control group that didn't get either the intelligence or the effort. And then they looked at a number of different outcomes. So I'll just highlight a few examples of what they found. First of all, the kids that got the intelligence-based feedback, when they were then later offered problem sets that were either challenging or were of the sort that they knew they could perform well on, they tended to select problems that they knew they could perform well on. These were what we refer to as performance goals. In other words, they picked problems that allowed them to continue to get the praise that they had received previously about being smart or talented. Whereas the kids that got feedback about their strong effort, when later presented with problems that were either easy or hard, more often than not, they picked the harder problems that stood to teach them more. So that's striking. It says that if you tell a kid that they're smart or talented, and that's the reason why they perform well, when they encounter challenges, they are likely to go with the least amount of challenge so that they can continue to receive that praise or feedback. Whereas if you receive praise and feedback for your strong effort, then later you tend to pick environments, problem sets, etc., that allow you to exert the very effort that got you the praise in the first place. So in both cases, these children are essentially attached to the praise, right? In some ways. I mean, we like to think that as well. But in both cases, the praise really serves to reinforce a certain pattern of behavior. But in the case of getting intelligence feedback, the kids are really reinforced being told that they're smart or talented, as opposed to reinforcing the engagement in the first place. And the converse is also true. Kids are told, hey, you really tried hard, and that's great. Or I like how you persisted, or you're so persistent. I can really see how persistent you are in trying to get the right answer, even if you don't get the right answer. Well, then when you present those kids with additional challenges, they work very hard to stay in challenge. The kids that are rewarded for effort and continue to pick harder problems outperform the kids that are given intelligence praise and feedback by a large margin.
AG1 is so much more than a green screen. In one single scoop, it delivers daily multivitamins, pre and probiotics, stress adaptogens, and yes, greens. It's AG1,
So what does this tell us? This tells us that the narratives that we hear from others, of course, reinforce certain patterns of behavior. What else does this tell us? It tells us that if you're a parent or teacher, you have to be very careful about giving feedback to a child that is attached to their identity around an endeavor, especially if they're performing well at that endeavor, right? And of course, if a child is not performing well at something, you also don't want to tell them that they're stupid, right? You don't want to tell them that they're deficient, right? But that's a rare occurrence in the classroom, one would hope. It's a rare occurrence on the field, one would hope. But what's very common, very, very common, is that when we see children or adults performing well, we tend to get them and we like. Now, the other thing we looked at in the study, besides whether or not these kids would pick hard or easier challenges down the line, were actual raw performance on these data, I must say, are so interesting. They took the kids and gave them all the same problems. And all the kids across the board, whether they were getting intelligence praise, or effort praise, or they were in a control group, were performing more or less the same way. Some of these questions right, some of these questions. Then they gave them praise after they completed those problems. They either got intelligence praise, smart, talented, or they got effort praise. You tried so hard, you really persisted. Then later, they gave them another set of problems. Now remember, the first time around, all the kids got some of the questions right and some of the questions wrong. So there's room for improvement for everyone. What they found was absolutely striking. The kids that were in the control group, so they didn't get any specific form of praise, they performed more or less the same way as they did before. So if they were getting 75% of the answers right the first time, they got 75% of the answers right the second time, 25% wrong in both cases. The kids that were in the intelligence praise group, the you're so smart, you're so talented praise group, their performance went down significantly. Whereas the kids that were in the effort praise group, their performance increased significantly. Okay, so this is a bidirectional effect where giving intelligence praise reduces performance and giving effort praise, which is absolutely stunning. It tells you everything you need to know, which is a parent, a teacher, and all rewarding yourself for effort is the best way to improve performance. Rewarding yourself is the identity label, so smart, so talented, you're a great athlete, etc. All that stare in the mirror and do self-affirmation stuff can actually undermine performance. And in fact, it does undermine performance. It may not do it right away, but eventually it does. And in a moment, the other thing this study looked at was this notion of persistence. So remember earlier I said that kids that got intelligence tended to be easier problems than kids that got effort praise. It turns out that the kids that got intelligence praise also tended to take on fewer challenges overall. They tended to limit the total number of challenges that they engaged in. Whereas the kids that got effort praise, you work so hard, you're so determined, it's so impressive how you just even when you got the answers wrong. Those kids not only opted for harder challenges, they not only performed better, but they also
one enemy remaining.
More challenges. So these data really make clear that effort praise is. Now I know many people have heard this whole thing about but it's actually pretty rare that we hear effort rewarded in everyday settings. And it is very common for us to overhear intelligence praise or talent praise. You know, a kid comes home with a trophy and great athlete.
Last player standing.
Report card, you're so smart, congratulations. A kid comes home with some sort of win in their world, and we tend to give them a label because we like to think that that label will get internalized and they'll see themselves as a winner. You can do anything, you're a winner, you're a winner. And of course, you don't want to be children or yourself or any other adult. You're a loser, right? You do not want to do that. You don't want to undermine performance that way. But it's very clear based on this research and a lot of other papers similar to it that we all have a giant blind spot sitting in our psychological field when we are getting and receiving praise. That really it is the sort of praise that's attached to the very efforts that led to the results that lead to even improved results over time. Okay, so this paper is really, truly important. It's a landmark paper in the field of psychology that is performance. And that's why I'm discussing it in detail here. But it actually includes one additional piece of information that I also think everyone should know. And that is the tendency for children who get intelligence praise to misrepresent their performance on subsequent efforts. What do I mean by that? Basically what I'm saying is, in this paper, they had the children perform on a given task, and then they either got intelligence praise, you were smart, you were talented, or effort praise. You worked so hard, you were so diligent, you kept going even when you faced the results. And then they had them do a series of other tasks, and then report their results to other kids. And what they found is that children who get intelligence praise, when they need to report their scores, either by walking up to the board and putting a little mark where their particular score is, or telling another student what their score was, or even writing it down on a piece of paper covertly so that it's not visibly being compared to all the other scores, the kids that got intelligence praise tend to lie about their score. And as you could imagine, they tend to lie in the direction of making themselves appear as having. This is a very sinister aspect of intelligence praise that we don't often hear about. Even if you've heard telling a person that they are smart or talented can performance, rarely if ever do we hear that telling someone that they're smart or talented can increase the probability that that person is going to misrepresent their performance in the future. And that's true regardless of whether or not they performed pretty well or not in the past. I mean, you could imagine that the kids that were told that they were talented, that those kids, you know, if they were doing well and then suddenly did poorly, the score up a little. We don't want anyone to do that, but you can imagine
One
how
enemy remaining.
preserve their ego. But no, in some cases, these kids are already performing pretty well. They're not getting 100%, but they're performing in the top bracket. And
30
yet,
seconds
if they
left.
received intelligence praise, they're still more likely to lie about their performance, increasing the
here.
Whereas the kids that receive the effort praise do no such thing. They faithfully represent their performance. And as I mentioned before, for many reasons that we'll talk about in a few minutes, meaning the mechanisms and what's really going on in the heads of these kids that get effort praise, performing better than everybody else. So just to illustrate how important the findings
10
of the study
seconds
really
left.
are, the paper was published in 1998. But just 2 years prior, in 1996, there was a survey asking what expected 85% answered that they thought that intelligence was fixed. That means they believe that the brain was sort of a vessel of fixed size, that, of course, when we're born into the world, it's kind of empty, we don't have any knowledge, but that the job of schooling was to teach kids things and reveal an intelligence capacity that was innate and that couldn't be increased upon. Whereas nowadays we really understand, mainly through our deeper understanding of neuroplasticity and how the brain learns, that indeed the brain can learn and that intelligence is not fixed. However, in 1998, when these studies were done, most people were of the core belief that intelligence is fixed, that it cannot be improved. And these results really drive home the fact that the type of feedback we get about
I've got your train.
our performance can undermine intelligence. Or if we receive feedback of effort, that our abilities can be improved. And when you look at any intelligence test, you look at a standard IQ test, or you go way out onto the other end of the continuum in terms of emotional intelligence, it is very clear that anyone and everyone can improve those
Spike planted.
exams, and in fact improve the various aspects of intelligence, and that forms of intelligence. So this paper was really ahead of its time, and it's really what seeded the entire field of growth mindset and the understanding of what that is. So now I'd like to shift our attention to not just how getting one form of praise to another form of praise can diminish, but really to ask why that is.
Last player
Because in that
standing.
understanding, there's a very simple set of tools, of narratives that you can tell yourself, or that you can tell a child as they are attempting to learn, that can your Before we go into it, however, I know many of you are listening to this with an eye towards the tools, meaning you want to know what the tools are that you can implement. Well, earlier I had you ask some questions. What are you good at? What are you good at? How did you arrive at being good? I also encourage you to think about what you can tell you're bad at, less good at, and what you tell yourself you're bad at and less good at, and how you arrive at that conclusion. Right now, I'd like you to ask yourself, what is your typical narrative when you are engaging in things that you believe you are good at? And what is your typical narrative, meaning your internal dialogue in your head, when you're engaging in things that you are not good at, or if you're not engaging in those things, when you think about engaging in those things. And the tool that's very effective to apply, even just in your own mind, is to start shifting your narrative from those performance narratives of being really good at something, bad at something, and to start to shift those narratives towards effort-related narratives. So I'll use myself. I'm pretty good at learning and remembering things, cognitive information. I'm pretty terrible at playing music. If I were to step back from those two statements, I could take an intelligence type praise narrative and tell myself, okay, I have a great
Last player
memory.
standing.
That's a intelligence praise type narrative. Or I could tell myself the truth, which is I tend to spend a lot of time with information in different forms. I listen to it, I read it, I write it down, I highlight it, I put it up on a whiteboard, I tell myself that information again in my head, I
Spike
think about it in
planted.
different contexts, I tell myself about it. That's how I developed a good memory for certain types of information, and that's still how I continue to build my memory and my information bank in my head to this day. It's not because I have a quote-unquote great memory,
One
but I
enemy
engage in certain
remaining.
verb processes to build up that memory.
Launching
I can
smoke.
also take a look at the negative statement. I am abysmal at music, which frankly is a fair statement. And I can say, okay, I'm just a terrible musician. I have no musical sense, no musical ability. Those are labels of intelligence type labels. Or I can look at the goals. This is also true. I have never really spent a lot of time trying to learn an instrument. I failed early on, at least in my mind. I failed to get the results I wanted, and so I stopped playing. I made the dog next door howl, which by the way I did, so I stopped playing. I ceased the effort process. And so in looking at it through that lens, yes, I'm a terrible musician, but I'm a terrible musician as a consequence of having never really engaged in the types of behaviors and effort over time that would have allowed me to be anything but a terrible musician. Now, I'm not asking you to do this exercise simply as a way to puff yourself up about the things you're good at and reward yourself for all the effort that went into it, nor am I asking you to look at the things that you're not good at and trying to take away some of the shame and blame, although that would be a good thing as well. That led to the fact that you're not good at these things. The reason I'm requesting that you ask those questions of yourself is that they can start to give you a sense of the actual tools and how those tools are implemented in order to get better at the things that you want to get better at. And this is a very important thing, to not set yourself up for getting worse at the things that you already think you're good at, because we'll soon talk about when we attach performance labels to things that we are really good at, we internalize that sense of self. Oh, I'm good at this particular thing. In the case of an intelligence label, it would be of the sort, okay, I have a great memory. But what happens when someone gives themselves or hears a performance or intelligence label around something they're good at, and then has an error or has a period where they're not that good at something? Well, if you internalize a you will also attach your identity to that diminished performance. Whereas if you attach effort, verbs, to why you got good at something, as well as why you are not good at something, well then there's only room for improvement. Why do I say that? Well, when we're talking about effort, we're talking about verbs. That is inherent to you. If you did it in one context, you can do it in another. Whereas ability and performance, it's not the case that if you have a good memory, you are by default a good musician. That might be the case, but in my case, certainly it's not. The point being that when you think about effort processes that you've engaged in before and over again, that allows you to continue to get better in a given domain, even when, or perhaps we should say, especially when you stop getting the results you want or you start getting poor results. And that effort process of practicing a lot, many repetitions, analyzing why you didn't get something right, that can be engaged in a lot of different endeavors across domains. So when we talk about verbs like effort or persistence or practicing a lot or analyzing
one enemy remaining.
Spike
down
when
B.
you start to think about your successes and your failures through those lenses, through the lens of groups, then you're really talking about something that's central to who you are. It's how you're wired. It's machinery that exists in your brain and nervous system and body that you can engage that time. As many of you know, I've been taking AG1 daily since 2012. I'm delighted that they're called today. AG1 is a vitamin, mineral, probiotic drink that's designed to meet all of your foundational nutrition needs. Of course, I try to get enough servings of vitamins and minerals through whole food sources that include vegetables and fruits. But oftentimes, I simply can't get enough servings. So with AG1, I'm getting vitamins, minerals, and probiotics that I need, and it also contains adaptogens to help muscle stress. Simply put, I always feel better when I take AG1. I have more focus, energy, and I sleep better, and it also happens to taste great. For all these reasons, whenever I'm asked, if you could take just one supplement, what would it be? I answer AG1. If you'd like to try AG1, go to drinkag1.com.
You would like to try AG1?
Special offer. Okay, so I've been talking about cognitive
processes.
And the basic take home is that labels of intelligence, labels of identity undermine performance. And a striking aspect of that, by the way, which I failed to mention earlier, is that if we receive those labels, being high performer, smart, talented, etc., either before or after a given task or game or exam, it still has a detrimental effect in both cases. Meaning, you tell someone heading into something, you're a great athlete, you're so smart, you're going to do so well on this exam. You undermine their performance. Or, if they take the exam and afterwards, before you see their scores or even afterwards,
one enemy remaining.
Spike
down
so
A.
Smart, you are so talented, you're undermining your performance. That's how striking these results are. Conversely, it's striking effort-based.
Last round before the switch.
Unfortunately, the same is true for effort-based things. So if before a kid or adult heads into a competition or exam, or preparation for a competition or exam, you say, you know what, I know you to be a really dedicated worker. You really persist. You know how to do hard things. You really dig your heels when it gets hard and you overcome challenges. If you do that before that child or adult heads into challenge, they will perform better. And if after an exam or performance or practice, whatever the effort happens to be, you tell them, you really work hard. I love the way that even when you got kicked in the shin and you're limping along there and you're hurt, you continue to play. Or even when everyone else went to sleep and you continue to study, although by the way, I do encourage people to get enough sleep. There are times in which, let's face it, the person who stays up latest studying, provided they get enough sleep, they're getting the extra hours. Right? Might have been that good in college, or tried to be that good in college. If you reward effort after the effort, you also set the mind, the brain of that child or adult up to provide more effort. So it's very clear. It doesn't matter if the timing of the praise comes before or after a given bout of effort. give identity praise before,
One enemy
you
remaining.
give identity praise after,
Spike down
subsequent
A.
performance diminishes. You give effort praise before, performance goes up. You give effort praise after, performance goes up. So I know I sound a little bit like a broken record, but we hear so often about growth mindset, about giving the right kind of praise, but it's not often that we are told when to give that praise. And the short answer
Last
is
player
it
standing.
doesn't matter. In fact, we should always be striving to give others and ourselves praise that is correctly attached. And that word correctly is important here. I'm not saying, take a kid who performed poorly on an exam because they kind of
30
loafed,
seconds
or the kid
left.
that was just shuffling their feet out on the soccer field and say, hey, great, you worked so hard when they didn't. We know when we're being lied to. But that should give you a sense of control, not a sense of lack of control. Because ultimately, effort is something that we
Switching sides.
In fact, whenever I hear the term control what you can control, I get a little bit nauseated and a little bit irritated too, because it's never clear what people are referring to. It's control what you can control. Focus on what you can control. What's the thing that we all really can control? It's our level of persistence and our level of effort. And of course, we all have different circumstances, such that persistence and effort can be harder in certain circumstances for certain people, certainly. But at the end of the day, at the end of the year, and at the end of our life, really the only thing that we really truly can control is where you place your attention and where you place your effort. Those are the two things that are really hard to do and really noticeable. No one can move effort for us. No one
I'm
can
baiting this
direct
guy.
effort for us. Things and people can try and divert or distract our attention. But ultimately, effort and that is intrinsic motivation come
With Shopify's mobile app, you can handle your business anywhere. Add and edit
Oh my
products,
god.
refresh your online store, and more, all on the go. Shopify, your all-in-one commerce platform.
Enemy spotted A.
Last player standing.
Bro,
Spike
like,
down
So it's clear that we have a striking set of results.
come on, bro.
Dweck and her colleagues.
I did not see Jet on the site, bro. Like, why are they just all...
That's what we're really building up to here. Okay, so this early work from Dweck and colleagues, and by early I mean early 90s, is really spectacular. It really transformed the way that we think about education and learning in general. And in fact,
I got a shitter ass
what it
Jet
didn't
on my
answer
team.
is why. Why is it that effort praise leads to better performance and intelligence praise, identity praise, leads to diminished performance? And it turns out that the answer resides in how people respond to errors, how they respond to feedback that they did not like. And there's a really nice study that looked at this mechanistically in the brain, to ask what's going on under the hood, and within the brain, when people who have one mindset or another adopt a growth mindset, that is the idea that if they engage in effort that they can get better at things, or if they have what's called a fixed mindset, this idea that if they're not performing well, it must be because they just simply can't perform well. They don't have the capacity or the ability to perform well. So the study I'm referring to is a study, first author Mangels, last author, no surprise, Carol Dweck, and it's entitled, Why Do Beliefs About Intelligence Influence Learning Success? Social Cognitive Neuroscience Model. I'm not going to go into all the details of the study, but this study used what's called ERPs, event-related potentials. Event-related potentials are measured by putting a cap on the skull that has a bunch of electrodes, but they don't penetrate the skull. They're picking up electrical potentials that correlate with shifts in brain activity. Now, an advantage of ERPs is that it's pretty non-invasive. Cutting into the skull, you don't have to remove any skin as you would if you were going to put electrodes down into the brain. Essentially, it's neurosurgery. And it's not as disruptive as being put into a functional magnetic imaging machine where you put into a tube and you have to lie motionless for an hour. Actually, it was in an MRI machine, not for any clinical reason, but just as a diagnostic scan recently. And nowadays, they allow you to watch Netflix in there or do something, but you have to stay very, very still. So it's hard for a lot of people to do that, but it can be done. If you need it to be done, you do it. But ERPs are great because people can come into the laboratory, put on this skull cap, and it's funny thing, it looks funny with all these wires coming out of it, and you can get a fairly good measure of global levels of activity across the brain. You can't really pinpoint fine structures, and you can't look at brain activity deep in the brain. That's probably the major drawback of looking at these ERPs, but you can see global shifts in activity across the brain, and the other advantage is you can do that while people are engaging in a lot of different types of tasks. You can move around a lot, whereas when you're in an MRI machine, you're in that little tube, you can't really do much. So this study had people equipped with these skull caps. Looks like kind of like a hoodie with a bunch of wires coming out of it. And they had them play a game. Basically what they did is they were asked questions. These are trivia questions. What's the capital of Australia? Australians are not everyone else should try. And then, here I'm paraphrasing, people indicated their confidence in how accurate they were in response. Okay, so they ask them a question like, what's the capital of Australia? The person would answer, and then they say, how confident are you on a scale of, say, 1 to 10 that you got the answer correct? And then they were given 2 pieces of feedback. And the first piece of feedback provided information only about their response accuracy. Were they right or were they not right? And then the second feedback was they got the correct answer. This is a pretty clever approach because it allowed the researchers to look at people's thinking as they're trying to get the right answer, then compare that to how confident they were that they had the right answer. You could imagine that if someone's really confident, like if you ask me, what's your name? And I say, Andrew, what's my confidence that my name is Andrew? 75%, just kidding, 100%, okay, 100%. Whereas if you asked me, I was confronted with this the other day, in your physics class, when they talk about the right-hand rule, which is, if you're listening, don't worry about it, it's just when you put out your index finger, your middle finger, your thumb with your right hand. And the right-hand rule is the magnetic field, the middle finger, the index finger, the thumb, and I'm pretty sure that it's the magnetic field is the middle finger. That's the vector of the middle finger. But how confident am I in this result? I don't know, maybe 50%. It's been a while since I've looked at this stuff. And I should know this, but I haven't looked at it, so 50%. When you give people these kinds of questions while recording brain activity, you're getting a lot of information. You're looking at accuracy, you're also looking at confidence, you're looking at lack of confidence, and you can correlate that with different patterns of brain activity. Now, they had essentially 2 groups of people in the study. One group had an intelligence mindset. They believed intelligence was more or less fixed. The other had what we call a growth mindset. They believed that through effort, that intelligence was malleable, that people could learn new information, including themselves, they could learn new information. And you wouldn't necessarily think that these 2 groups showed the pattern of brain activity in response to getting things right or wrong while the brain was being moved, but in fact, that's exactly what happened. There's a certain waveform of activity. The name isn't very important. It's called the P3 wave in ERP experiments. P3 wave is a certain pattern of activity that emerged during the presentation to the subject that they'd gotten something wrong. So the P3 wave, it's just a little blip in neural activity in the brain, correlated with when people were told, nope, you got that one wrong. Okay? And what was really interesting is that the height of the P3, this, let's just call it an error signal because it correlated with the error signal, this nope, you got it wrong signal in the brain, that signal was larger in people with a fixed mindset as opposed to in people with a growth mindset. Now, what was especially interesting is that the location of that activity was above a brain area called the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC. The anterior cingulate cortex is a structure involved in many different functions. But one of its primary functions is that in the front of the ACC, what we call the rostral or inferior ACC, activity there tends to correlate with emotional responses. It tends to correlate with our internal sense of interoception. Whereas in the dorsal ACC, meaning the top of the ACC, activity there tends to correlate with cognitive information and cognitive appraisal. Meaning this structure has a lot of different functions, but it's got a little area within it that tends to be more related to our emotional or somatic responses to things. And it's got another area inside of it that tends to be more related to our thinking, our cognition. And what was really interesting is that in the group that had the fixed mindset, when they were told that they got something wrong, there tended to be a greater signal in that rostral or anterior ACC, meaning they had a bigger emotional response to it, or at least the neural activity suggested that. Whereas people with a growth mindset, when presented with got something wrong, the error signal within their brain tended to reside or even to shift toward areas that are associated with cognitive appraisal. And so the conclusion of this study, as well as other studies using functional magnetic resonance imaging that have looked at civil intelligence, is that when people have a growth mindset and they are presented with the information that they got something wrong, rather than just feel it as a somatic response or an emotional response, they tend to appraise it. They tend to direct their attentional resources toward trying to understand what the error was and why they made the error. And this, I believe, is absolutely fundamental to understanding the distinction between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. Because perhaps you've seen these lists, these side-by-side lists that, fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. Fixed mindset is one in which you're trying to look smart, that you're not so focused on effort, that your response to setbacks is to give up, and your academic and other forms of performance tends to be low. Whereas in a growth mindset, your goal tends to be to learn. You tend to value effort more. You tend to respond to setbacks by working harder, and your performance is higher. And I'm not trying to make light of these lists. These lists are important because they help us organize our information and differentiate between a fixed versus growth mindset. But they don't tell us why focusing on effort and engaging more effort would actually translate into higher performance. For instance, you could imagine a scenario where the exact opposite is true, right? We could make up a Gesso story where if your identity is so rigidly fixed to high performance, you're likely to outwork everybody. That seems like a logical conclusion as well. But that's not the way it plays out. It's when your identity is attached to a sense of ability to engage in ongoing effort, especially when you receive signals that you're getting things wrong or not performing well, that is tied to elevated performance. And the study using ERPs tells us that's likely to
One
be the case
enemy remaining.
because of how people who have a growth mindset focus their attention when they're told, nope, you got it. Or when people think they got something right? They give an answer and they say, what's your confidence level? And they say 90%, maybe 99%, maybe even 100%. It's wrong. People who have a fixed mindset focus on the emotional response to that. More of their brain resources are devoted to, I got it wrong, I thought I got it right. Then the people who have a growth mindset who are thinking, wait, okay, then what was that answer? And how could I possibly get that answer wrong? I'm going to figure that out. Okay? Now, as you're hearing this, you're probably thinking, oh no. I'm
Knife
somebody
that,
who
and then you
absolutely
can
gets
brim
disappointed
ult him
when
out,
something
brim.
is wrong.
I don't know,
Unfortunately, this is
maybe,
not just
if
about
he's there.
100 milliseconds to 5 seconds after you're told something is wrong. You can shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset response. In fact, that's an important tool that we all need to learn how to implement. We all suffer from fixed mindset. All suffer from fixed mindset in certain endeavors. And when we get things wrong, especially when there's some embarrassment or shame, which often accompanies when we think we were very right, we're convinced we're right, that fixed mindset can really hijack our emotional response. But
down B.
there are a lot of data that point to the fact that at those
Last
moments, if we
player
think, okay, I'm
standing.
going to step back from that and I'm going to just think about the error. I'm going to think about what led to the error, and I'm going to start devoting my attentional resources to that process. That process itself can be built up over time such that we start to outweigh the fixed mindset with growth mindset simply by devoting our attentional resources to the error, acknowledging it happened, maybe feeling something about it, maybe not. It's really hard to control our feelings. What we can control, as I mentioned before, is our effort and our attention. So focusing our attention on why we got something wrong and really digging into that, that's growth mindset in action. So you'll notice as we have this discussion about the more mechanistic underpinnings of growth mindset is that we're not talking about psychological terms as much. We're not talking about ego protection. We're not talking about identity. Now, all of those things are extremely important. But the problem with things like ego protection and identity is that when we are faced with results that we don't want, and we are faced with those results in a real-world context, we're not getting the results we want in school, in work, in athletics, in relationships, etc., we hear these messages and we try to set our ego aside or not attach our identity so much to what is happening. But it's really, really hard. And it's really, really hard because statements like set your ego aside or don't attach yourself to it so much are wonderful aspirations, but there's no actual process that one can go through by oneself that allows you to immediately disentangle yourself from your ego, right? I mean, there's this whole process of ego dissolution we talked about in the episode with Robin Carter-Harris, but none of that was directed at specific challenges that one is undertaking in real time, right? So when you're faced with results that you don't like, you can't simply step back, nor should you expect yourself to be able to step back and say, oh, I'm not going to get upset about this error, right? It makes perfect sense why you would get upset about not getting the results that you want. However, once you start to understand some of the mechanistic underpinnings of what will allow you to rescue your performance, that is to start focusing on those errors from the cognitive,
Bro, how do I miss that?
or even a combination of emotional and cognitive, right? It's very hard to suppress an emotional response to something, but oftentimes we can enhance our attention to the cognitive parallel. And in doing so, we can kind of rob some of the emotional response. And when we do that sort of thing, it's hard. And anytime we do hard things, we generally want to know that the doing of those hard things is working, that it's in service to something. And the study I just reviewed, as well as what I'm going to talk about next, really points to the fact that building up a practice, a capacity of focusing on one's effort, on focusing on the errors one made from a cognitive standpoint, and really trying to understand what led to those errors is the basis. It's the cornerstone of building that growth mindset. It does, however, require that we don't just tell ourselves to focus on effort and the errors and analyzing those errors. It also requires an additional piece, which is what we're going to talk about now. I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge our sponsor, Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker is a personalized nutrition platform that analyzes data from your blood and DNA to help you better understand your body and help you meet your health goals. I'm a big believer in getting regular blood work done for the simple reason that many of the factors that impact your immediate and long-term health can only be analyzed from a quality blood test. However, with a lot of blood tests out there, you get information back about blood lipids, about hormones, and so on, but you don't know what to do with that information. With Inside Tracker, they have a personalized platform that makes it very easy to understand your data, that is, to understand what those lipids, what those hormone levels, etc. mean, and behavioral, supplement, nutrition, and other protocols to adjust those numbers to bring them into the ranges that are ideal for your immediate and long-term health. Inside Tracker's ultimate plan now includes measures of both ApoB and their insulin, which are key indicators of cardiovascular health and energy regulation. If you'd like to try Inside Tracker, you can visit insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 20% off any of Inside Tracker's plans. Again, that's insidetracker.com/Huberman to get 20% off. Okay, so by now I like to think that we all understand what growth mindset is and what differentiates it from a fixed mindset. However, just understanding what growth mindset is and having a desire to implement it and a bit of understanding of how to implement it turns out to be necessary, but not so much. There's an additional piece that we need to accomplish. The good news is that additional piece is very straightforward to understand. If we zoom out and we start to really understand that growth mindset is really a way of connecting motivation to cognition. It's taking this thing that we call motivation, which is of course what we all want. We all want to be motivated. We all want to be effort-driven, etc. And we take motivation and we tie it to a set of specific thoughts or thought processes that we can control. That is far and away different than looking at motivation simply as an emotional or an internal state of quote-unquote feeling motivated. And in fact, that's what most people, including myself, default to. We want to feel motivated. So fortunately, we try and get good sleep, which is essential. That really helps for daytime mood focus and alertness, and thereby motivation. We hydrate, we exercise, we might even drink caffeine as a way to increase our level of alertness and motivation. And all of that is fine and good. In fact, all of that is encouraged, although I would say that the caffeine part is optional. But all those other things are encouraged for mental health, physical health, and performance, and motivation. But what growth mindset is really about is it's taking this thing that we call motivation and it's saying, okay, what are the specific types of thoughts and actually the specific thoughts, the specific cognitive processes that will allow us to feel more motivated, especially under conditions where something is hard or where we are not getting the results. And in order to master that process, we need to embrace another mindset. That's right. In order to access growth mindset, it's very clear that we need to be able to think about errors and we need to overcome errors and we need to devote our attention to errors. We need to devote our attention to reframing what's going on in our head when we're feeling not motivated, etc. And all of that is really hard to do from a purely psychological standpoint. But there's this additional mindset, which has to do with our mindset around stress and frustration itself, that can allow us to access growth mindset far more easily. And this mindset around stress actually has a name. It's called the stress is enhancing mindset. And there's a very straightforward way to increase your stress is enhancing mindset. So first I want to step back and acknowledge the person who really made some of the key fundamental discoveries.
Yo, KO, you have 19 kills, but I promise you, you're doing nothing for the team, bro.
Ali Crum.
Like, you are doing absolutely shit for the team. I don't know if you're doing that on purpose, but like, you are absolutely shit.
And I promise you that she is so successful in all those categories by way of immense amounts of effort. In addition to that, she also happens to be an incredibly kind person and generous person. She was a guest on this podcast previously. You can find that episode in the show note captions or by going to humanlab.com and simply searching for Mindset Crum, C-R-U-M. Her personal story and her work and the tools she offers are absolutely spectacular. However, you don't need to go to that episode just yet. I'm going to talk about some of those tools now, and I'm going to talk about how using those tools can allow you to access growth mindset. And then I'm going to talk about how the combination of applying a stresses enhancing mindset with a growth mindset acts synergistically to even further improve performance in the short term. The stresses enhancing mindset is the outgrowth of many different studies, and not just from Dr. Ali Crum, but from others as well. But for the time being, I want to focus on one paper in which Dr. Crum was the first author. So this work was done before she arrived at Stanford. The paper is entitled Rethinking Stress, the Role of Mindset. And the key takeaway from this paper is that how we think about stress impacts how we react to stress. So much so, in fact, that what this paper illustrates is that if people are given even just a short tutorial about some of the negative consequences of stress on learning and performance and their physiology and their health, they experience a lot of negative consequences of stress.
I can't see. You're fucking flash blinding me. You don't even know how to fucking throw it.
And those people will experience performance enhancement
Holy
when
shit.
they are confronted with stress in a learning or other performance enhancement. So what we are talking about here is not the placebo effect. I want to be very clear about people. We're also not talking about lying to people in order to shift their response to stress. What we're talking about here is two different conditions. One condition where people are exposed to information that is true about how stress can diminish performance. And another condition in which people are exposed to information that is also true about how stress can enhance performance. Now you might be saying, how can it be true that stress is both performance diminishing and stress is performance enhancing? Therein lies the key thing. It depends on what you believe about stress. In fact, a different way to umbrella this whole discussion is to say that how you think about stress impacts the stress response in profound ways. So this paper, Rethinking Stress, the Role of Mindsets in Determining Stress, did a very simple set of manipulations. They had people in one group listen to a lecture that effectively was titled, quote, "The effects of stress are negative and should be avoided." And that lecture included information about how stress diminishes performance and how it can diminish health and vitality, learning and performance, productivity, it increases uncertainty, etc. Okay? And all of that information is true. A separate group listened to a lecture entitled, quote, "Experiencing stress improves health and vitality." And again, that information is true. Now I realize that some of you are probably still asking, how can it be that stress diminishes health and performance and stress also enhances health and performance? And the answer lies in two things. One, the level of stress, and therefore the level of hormones that are released in response to that stress, the duration over which the stress response occurs. But key variable here is that our cognitive understanding about what stress does impacts whether or not our physiology
A
goes
useless
in the direction of
ass
debilitating
KO, bro.
Okay, so we've got a condition here where people are being informed very differently about what stress does. In one case, it's the stress is bad message. In the other case, it's the stress is good message. And there are many different experiments within this paper. But one of the more interesting ones, I believe, is where they looked at work performance, both in terms of what they call
like,
soft tasks.
there's no way he got more damage per round than me, bro.
A group that was given information about how stress diminishes performance on the soft tasks. Okay, so the somewhat easy tasks.
That dude was dog shit, bro.
As you compare,
I swear to God, KO was dog shit, bro.
Whereas the people who learn that stress is enhancing actually experience some improvement in work performance, even though the challenge that they're facing isn't that great. So again, what this means is that learning that stress can enhance performance by providing people true information about how stress can enhance performance can increase performance even in the context of stuff that's not that hard, not that stressful. Even more interesting is that when you look at performance on tasks that are considered hard and you compare the stress is diminishing group, meaning the group that was taught that stress is diminishing, and compare that to the stress is enhancing group, you see a really divergent response. The people that learn that stress diminishes performance did not improve at all, whereas the people that learn that stress can enhance their performance significantly. Now keep in mind, all they are doing is learning that stress can enhance their performance, and then they're given a task and they're performing better. So that's pretty spectacular, right? There's no training session that they went and did. They didn't practice these items that they were being tested on in between. They weren't given a bunch of drills to do, and they didn't take a lot of time to do it. They just heard a tutorial about how stress can enhance performance. And that, I believe, is remarkable, because what it says is that our cognitive appraisal about stress, which we all are going to experience in life, right? Elevated heart rate, narrowing of visual focus, shifting of blood away from the periphery. All of these things are characteristic features of the stress response that we learn, especially in this day and age, because it's talked about a lot in popular culture, that, all of these mechanisms were put into us in order for us to get away from the saber-toothed tiger or the lion that's trying to eat us. Let's be fair. The stress response is there for a lot of reasons, not just because of saber-toothed tigers and lions. I mean, that's kind of a story that we make up. The stress response is inherent not just to us, but to other species as a way to mobilize us either away from things or toward things, right? We need to have somewhat of a stress response in order to engage in adaptive challenge. Yes, it's true that hundreds of thousands of years ago, those adaptive challenges probably involved hunting. But they probably involved social challenges as well. Do you think it was, easy for cavemen and women to engage socially and, kind of settle out their romantic interactions, etc.? Do you think it was easy for them to raise children? No, of course not. The stress response is there for a variety of reasons, not just to get away from predators. The really exciting thing that's been discovered in the course of Ali Crumb's work and other work in the last couple of decades is that the stress response is neither good nor bad. The stress response depends on whether or not you believe the sensations that you're experiencing, elevated heart rate, narrowing of visual focus, etc., are serving to enhance your performance or diminish your performance. And this study really points to the fact that just learning that it can enhance performance. Now, I know a number of you are probably saying, wait, but stress doesn't feel good, right? And oftentimes we experience stress under conditions where we're trying to learn or get good at something or listen better or do something, and it actually is diminishing performance. I think it's important to acknowledge that. This study and studies like it are not saying that stress becomes pleasant as a sensation in the body, nor is it saying that it always leads to improved performance. I don't want you to think that's the take-home message. Sometimes it does, it can, as was demonstrated in this research paper, but oftentimes, as we know, stress diminishes our performance. It takes us away from the landmarks we want to hit. It takes us away from the grades we want to get. It takes us away from, quote-unquote, showing up how we want to. Right? We don't want to have the blotchy skin and the sweating and the quaking of voice when we're trying to do public speaking and things of that sort. No one wants any of that. What's important to understand is that learning that stress is a way of mobilizing resources in the body does two things. First of all, it allows us to dampen or adjust the stress response in real time, and it allows us to understand that that stress response heightens our level of focus in a way that allows us to pay attention to the things that are going wrong in a way that allows us to make correction to those errors in the future. So if you think back to that study, that ERP study where they measured brain activity and they looked at people who had a fixed mindset versus people who had a growth mindset, and the people who had a growth mindset were paying more cognitive attention to what was happening during errors and after errors. Well, this stress is enhancing mindset is very powerful because what it does is it shifts one's attention away from kind of somatic experience of, oh my goodness, my heart rate is elevated, I'm sweating, I'm quaking, I sound terrible, I feel terrible, I look terrible, etc., to a mode of allocating more of our thinking toward analyzing why things might be going wrong. And something else powerful happens when we embrace a stress is enhancing mindset as well. When we embrace a stress is enhancing mindset, it turns out that some of the very physiological processes that we call quote-unquote stress shift in important ways. Some of those include the duration over which the stress hormone cortisol is released. And in fact, I don't even really want to call it a stress hormone because cortisol does so many other things as well, and it's not bad. You need cortisol. Believe me, you want cortisol, especially released early in the day and in response to acute stressors. What you don't want is for cortisol to stay elevated for long, long periods of time, and you especially don't want it to interfere with your sleep. Okay, so much so that I think at times I wonder whether or not our philosophy on stress should be that stress is fantastic for us, except when it interferes with our sleep, right? And when stress becomes terrible for us is when it starts to be chronically elevated, and especially when it starts to inhibit our ability to sleep well enough and long enough. Okay, so the point here is that when we embrace a stress is enhancing mindset, we are able to have shorter duration release of cortisol. We are also able to engage what's called increased stroke volume under conditions of stress. This gets a little bit technical, but the amount of blood that your heart can pump with each beat turns out to be a key metric of stress. When we are very stressed, even though we need to mobilize a lot of resources, somewhat paradoxically, our total stroke volume can actually be reduced, and we tend to shuttle blood and other resources towards the core of our body and towards major limbs and away from things like our brain and our periphery. So one of the key measures of how a stress response is going is how much peripheral blood flow there is. And when we are more relaxed under conditions of stress, there tends to be more peripheral blood flow. When we are more anxious, more panicked under conditions of stress, peripheral blood flow is lower. And in a remarkable set of experiments, Ali Crum and colleagues have shown that when we are just taught that stress can be enhancing, and then we are placed into a stressful environment, either because we are imagining stress or we are experiencing real stress, and then our physiology is measured, what is observed is that the total amount of blood that the heart can pump with each beat is actually increased. Peripheral blood flow increases, and our ability to maintain cognition, to think clearly on this. Again, the only manipulation here is a tutorial about how stress can be enhancing, because essentially in fact, for those of you that perhaps have heard stress reduces testosterone levels, stress reduces estrogen levels, etc., that's true. It is also true, by the way, that when you are informed about how stress can be enhancing of performance, it becomes anabolic. That's right. It actually can lead to deployment of androgens and estrogens, things that many, not all people, desire to have increased or certainly desire to not have diminished below their normal baseline. So there's a lot of false stories out there about stress. Not false because what you're hearing is wrong, because indeed chronic stress, chronically elevated cortisol can reduce testosterone, reduce estrogen, diminish sleep, diminish immunity, etc. But it is also true that stress under conditions where one believes that stress can be enhancing, it can be anabolic, it can be pro-testosterone, pro-estrogen, it can be pro-cortisol regulation in ways that allow you to focus your cognition, and so on and so forth. Now that's exciting, but I do realize that for some people it might be sufficiently vague to make you wonder, well, how do I know if I'm getting the right response from stress or the wrong response? And the simple answer there is the more that you can learn about how stress can enhance performance, and the more that you place yourself into safe yet stressful adaptive circumstances. So these are going to be circumstances where you stand to learn or grow in some positive way, not circumstances where you stand to hurt yourself or others, of course. The more that you can place yourself into conditions of stress, and then to cognitively just tell yourself, this elevated heart rate, this quaking of my hands, this sweating, etc. This is my body mobilizing resources. And the more that you can tell yourself that that's actually affording you an advantage in being able to allocate your attention to specific things, maybe why you made an error, and analyzing that, or maybe why you succeeded at something, and thinking about the steps that led to that success. The more that you can link that to the processes that are taking you in the directions that you do and don't want to go, and thinking about them, because indeed that's what stress can allow you to do, the more that you are shifting your mind away from thinking about just the raw, uncomfortable sensations of stress. You're putting a cognitive appraisal on a physiological process. You are thinking about stress in a way that is changing what that stress is doing. And you're taking your brain and body from a negative state, just to put a little bit of subjective valence on it, to negative, right? Nobody wants to have the bad stress response, to a positive state. And when you develop a stress is enhancing mindset, you not only are going to feel more comfortable under conditions of stress, but you are also developing the perfect tool to plug into the whole process of building up your growth mindset in a way that allows those two things, growth mindset and stress is enhancing mindset, to synergize and to dramatically improve performance in the short and long term. And that's not just a statement that I'm making, that's what the research tells us. So let's take a look at that research. So now I'd like to shift our discussion to some very recent findings about growth mindset and how growth mindset among the stresses can powerfully change outcomes for the better, and can do so in a huge variety of real-world contexts. And the work that I'm referring to is the work of a person named David Yeager. Dr. David Yeager is a professor at the University of Texas, Austin. He did his graduate work with Carol Dweck at Stanford, and he now has his own laboratory in Boston. And both when he was a graduate student with Carol and in his own laboratory, he's been doing very impressive, large-scale studies, many thousands of subjects. It's important. And using subjects from diverse areas, rural, urban, etc., affluence, lack of affluence, and finding essentially that when students are taught about a growth mindset, what it is, how it benefits the mindset, and when those same students are also taught about what a stress is enhancing mindset is, cultivating that, again, simply through informational tutorial, watching a video about growth mindset, watching a video about stress is enhancing mindsets, and then confronted with stress, confronted with tests, confronted with opportunities to embrace hard challenges or easier paths, across the board, the results show up again and again as students who are taught about a growth mindset and are taught that stress is enhancing perform better. Now, Jaeger and colleagues have shown that across a huge number of different experiments. In fact, there's a paper published quite recently, this was about a year ago, in July of 2022, in the journal Nature, so Apex Journal, published as a full article in Nature and Science and elsewhere. They have letters and shorter formats like reports, and then there are the articles which correspond to major findings. So they published the following results as an article in Nature in July of 2022. The title of the paper is "A Synergistic Mindsets Intervention Protects Adolescents from Stress." And what I absolutely love about this paper is that it includes a lot of different kinds of experiments. So for instance, they looked at high school students who simply anticipated a stressful event and had been instructed on growth mindset or stress is enhancing mindset or both, or control conditions where they weren't informed of those mindsets, right? It's always important to have control experiments where you're getting the same amount of information, but it's not the same information. And what they found was that anticipatory stress, right? The stress that we feel in anticipation of something that we think is going to happen is reduced when we are educated about growth mindset and we are educated about a stress is enhancing mindset. And the basic takeaway from that experiment was, yes, indeed, being educated on what a growth mindset is and how it differs from a fixed mindset, which you now have been educated on, definitely buffers you against stress. In addition, being educated on how stress can enhance performance can buffer you against anticipatory stress. But it is clearly the case that when one is educated on both of those things, growth mindset and stress is enhancing mindsets, that one observes the greatest buffering or offset of the stress response in ways that can improve. That is but one experiment of the six experiments included in this single paper. Now, I'm not going to go through each of those 6 experiments in detail. And just as a side note, I've invited Dr. David Jaeger to be a guest on this podcast, and he has agreed when he's a guest on this podcast. I'm sure he will detail all the intricacies of those experiments in order to inform us about exactly what was done and how, so that we can benefit from that information. But just by way of example, another experiment in this paper used what was called the Trayer Social Stress Test. And the reason I'm going to highlight this a little bit is because I think it relates to a lot of things that many of us have experienced and that will experience that are considered stressful. And of course, we would all like ways to buffer ourselves against stress and or leverage that stress to improve our performance, as well as adopt a growth mindset. So the Trayer Social Stress Test is a kind of standard mode of stressing people out in the laboratory or in the classroom. So basically, the subject comes in, you tell them to wait a little bit of time, then you measure their stress response at rest, looking at their heart rate, their blood pressure. You might have them spit into a little tube and use that saliva to measure cortisol. So that's cortisol. Then you're going to tell them that they're going to prepare a speech for presentation in front of a small group of actual people. Then they actually deliver that speech in front of that audience. During that speech, sometimes the people who are observing it are giving feedback, frowns, crossed arms, etc. Then there's a pop quiz where they get a hard arithmetic test in front of that audience. And when they get answers wrong, they're told they're wrong in front of that audience. This all might seem playful and silly to you, but most people do not experience this as playful and silly. Almost everybody who goes into one of these experiments as a subject feels some level of stress, especially those that don't like public speaking, especially those that don't see themselves as very proficient in arithmetic, or that don't like to work out problems in real time in front of people. You can see how this would be stressful. And all the while, measures of psychological and physiological reactivity are being measured. Peripheral blood flow, the thing we talked about earlier, among those. What I just described is pretty extensive, but I provide all that as a backdrop so that you can understand what happened before, which was people were simply educated on growth mindset and or stress mindset or not. So basically what we have here is a condition in which people are just getting information. Right? Treadmill, there's no going home and doing a bunch of problem solving. And what they observed in this experiment, all the other experiments in this quite massive paper, is that the mere learning about growth mindset and stress is enhancing mindset allows these students to shift their physiology, enhance peripheral blood flow, changes in hormones such as cortisol, and shifts in their psychology such that when they feel stressed, they start to see that and experience that as an opportunity for challenge and to lean into that challenge. And where they are told that they got the wrong answer, where they are told that they are not performing well, they are able to think about that and to allocate their mental resources such that then they do start to perform better.
Google Pixel 3%. I love how clear the pictures look. I thought it was real creative how we did a whole photo shoot on the phone. That's cute. I like that.
And the major takeaway from this study is that across the board in all 6 experiments, imagined stress, real stress, laboratory stress, actual classroom stress, and in embracing future challenges, just the learning about what stress can enhance your performance mindset is allowed students to do just that. Now, another really interesting feature of this study put out by Yeager and colleagues was that the interventions were one time and relatively brief, or we could even say extremely brief. Whereas a lot of previous experiments had looked at growth mindset interventions that were on the order of 4 to 6 to 8 tutorials lasting anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour each. This experiment employed just one 30-minute intervention. So when I heard about these results and read the paper, I got very excited. I wanted to know, what is this magic intervention exactly? And I'm sure you're thinking the same. So I contacted Dr. Yeager, and he was gracious enough to provide me some examples of what's contained within this tutorial so that I could give you those examples in real time during this episode. So basically, the tutorial starts off with a question about stress. It actually has a little field where you can fill in an answer to the question. Can you recall a time when you experienced stress, and what was that stress related to? And here I'm paraphrasing. So what I put in response to this, because I actually filled out the form itself, was when I was a postdoc, by the way, is the 4 to 6 year period of time that comes after your PhD training. I wrote, when I was a postdoc,
Player standing.
I was under a lot of competitive pressure trying to finish my projects. I was working under a diminished income, meaning I wasn't getting paid very much relative to the cost of living in the area at the time. And I was also socially isolated from a lot of my friends that previously I had lived very close to. That was a stressful time that I can recall. In fact, no other time in my life, as I recall, was as stressful as being a postdoc. I'm not to say that I didn't enjoy being a postdoc. I delighted in doing the science I did and being surrounded by the people I was surrounded by, but it was very, very stressful for those and additional reasons. So that's how this tutorial starts off. And I believe that the reason that they asked that question at the beginning of the tutorial is to kind of cue up cognitive mechanisms that surround one's own understanding of stress. And then as you click through the tutorial, it starts to explain, of all things, neuroscience and neuroplasticity. It says, research from neuroscience tells us that through effort, our brain can change. It can form new connections that we call synapses. So, of course, I was delighted to see all that information. I'm very familiar with that type of information. It also says things like, and here I'm reading directly from the tutorial, difficulty, struggle, and frustration when you're learning something are not signs that you've reached your limits. They're signs that you're expanding your limits. Okay, then you go to the next field, and it says, let's hear from a scientist. Uri Treisman is one of the top calculus professors. Here's what he tells his students on the first day of class. Quote, everyone in this class will struggle, no matter who you are. Questions are going to be flying at you that you cannot answer. And when that happens, you're going to experience stress. And if you don't understand that stress, you'll think it means, oh no, I don't belong here. But in fact, that stress is an indicator that your understanding is deepening. It's not a sign that you're not learning. It's a sign that you are learning. Okay, so I could read this entire tutorial for you, but that would take up far too much of our time. But I think you get the essence of it, which is that with each slide within the tutorial, you're being told that the thing that you're experiencing that could potentially feel negative means negative. You're suffering. You're suffering health-wise. You're suffering performance-wise. Is reappraised. It's telling you no. The frustration, the agitation, the thought that you're not capable of doing better, it's actually the opposite. So what this tutorial really is it's an information-based tutorial. It tells you something about the brain's capacity to change. It gives you some true, by the way, mechanistic information about how synapses can change and brain circuits can change, because indeed they can. And it's telling you that the negative somatic, bodily, and cognitive, thought-based experiences of stress, that those represent you getting better. That's simply what it is. And despite it being simple in its specific message, that message turns out to be incredibly powerful. How can we say that it's truly powerful? Well, we could turn to essentially any page in this study that Yeager and colleagues did and see that, for instance, the intervention, again, this is the combination of learning about growth mindset and learning that stress can be performance enhancing, led to 40% improvement in self-regard. So self-regard is something that can be measured, very negative or very positive self-regard, 40% improvement in self-regard. There was like 14% improvement in passing of courses that were of the particularly challenging type. And there was also a significant improvement in passing of courses that were less challenging. In addition to that, people who watched and engaged in the tutorial also took on additional hard challenges in the future, long after the intervention had ceased. Now, there are a number of other features of the David Yeager work that I think are especially important to consider. But rather than go into the specifics of those experiments, I'm going to frame them in the context of some very specific tools that I've spelled out this episode, based on this research, that you can use in order to build a growth mindset and in order to build the stress enhances. Now, in some sense, all of our discussion during this episode up until now has served as a tutorial about growth mindset and about stress enhances performance and how those two things can be combined in order to get a synergistic positive effect. Nonetheless, I do think that it's useful, especially when thinking about cognitive tools, which are often less concrete and clear to people how they can implement them compared to, say, exercise tools like get 200 minutes of zone 2 cardio per week, or get 6 sets of resistance exercise per major muscle group per week, etc. All of that stuff in the physical domain is very concrete, whereas stuff that relates to tools in the cognitive domain sometimes can feel a little bit abstract. So for that reason, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes and list off some of the key elements to building up a growth mindset and a stress enhances performance mindset that are gleaned from the literature that I've talked about now and related to it. The first tool is that whenever possible, if both the teacher and the student can adopt a growth mindset and a stress enhances performance mindset, that's the best case scenario. This is in the classroom and it's been shown in other contexts. And again, it simply means learning about what growth mindset is and how it differs from fixed mindset. It also ideally means learning how stress can enhance performance. Now, if that means spending some time with the discussion that we had around Dr. Leah Crumb's data, that would be great. If it also means just thinking about the stress response and understanding that that stress response indeed is mobilizing resources, it's focusing your vision more narrowly, right? You sort of lose the forest through the trees, and yet that allows you to really analyze carefully whatever it is that you choose to focus your attention on, well, then that's going to be performance enhancing. Again, these tools are purely cognitive, but they are well supported by the data. And the data also tell us that when teachers and students both adopt this mindset, the teachers are viewing the students as less fixed in their abilities, and the students are viewing themselves as less fixed. The next tool, which is a really fundamental one to everything we're talking about, was actually mentioned at the beginning of the episode, which is whenever giving praise or giving feedback of any kind to others or to yourself, perhaps even especially to yourself, make the effort to make that feedback about verbs, not labels. Okay? To really think about praising or, in some cases, maybe giving feedback about how effort could have been better. But ideally, you're saying, great effort. It was great that when you missed that shot on goal, that you ran back to your side of the field. It was great that when you didn't perform well on that math exam, that you went back to those problem sets and that you conversed with other students about they had performed a certain way and you really dug through it and figured out why you got things wrong. Now, a key aspect of this tool of focusing on verbs, not labels, is that it is especially important to do this when you perform well. I talked about the reasons a little bit earlier, but I cannot emphasize this enough. When you've performed well, if you tell yourself or you tell somebody else that they're just a great student, they're talented, they're brilliant, I promise you, you're undermining their future performance when they inevitably encounter challenge. If, however, you give yourself or the other person feedback that's really grounded in effort and persistence and problem solving, you are absolutely going the right direction. If you are going to give feedback about errors, either to yourself or to somebody else, the question really is, do you paint that with rose-colored glasses? Do you try and make it seem like the errors weren't that bad? That's not actually what we're talking about. We're not talking about, what do they say, putting lipstick on a pig. What we're talking about is looking at those errors and thinking about what led up to those errors and trying to put more of our cognitive attention on the verbs, the things that led to those errors, and less of our attention on the emotions related to those errors. We really need to be analytic about those errors. And admittedly, we often need to take a day or two, or maybe even longer before we can do that process effectively, right? Nothing that I've said thus far has said that we have to do all of this immediately after an error or immediately after a poor performance. Sometimes we are so caught up in the personal experience of having performed not as well as we would have liked that there's simply no way that we can allocate our resources. Ideally we can, but oftentimes we can't. So we have to be, what do they say, gentle with ourselves and allow ourselves to move through that process and then get back to it. But we really want to focus on the verbs leading to those errors, not putting labels on the stupid, ridiculous, silly, fill in your blank with whatever label you might have. Okay, so verbs for analyzing why we did well, and verbs for analyzing why we did poorly. Now, you may have noticed that a few minutes ago I mentioned that oftentimes it's beneficial that when we make errors that we seek out others who either performed well,
One enemy
ideally,
remaining.
but also those who performed poorly in order to get some understanding as to why we did not perform. And that raises another key tool. There are a lot of data now to support the fact that one of the key ways to analyze our errors is to
Switching
get.
sides.
And this is one of the things that really differentiates the high performers from the low performers over time. And yes, there I just used the label. Well, I guess I could have said the high effort, which leads to performance people, versus the low effort, which leads to low performance people. But in any case, you get the idea. People who perform well over time, regardless of labels you place on them, tend to be people who seek help in order to understand why they didn't perform well. So this is a core component of not just trying and building a growth mindset, but really solidifying a growth mindset and a stress and enhanced performance mindset. So seek help from others in understanding where you didn't perform as well as you'd like. And I would say seek input from others as to what were the verbs that you think might have led to your heightened performance. Because we like to think that we have really good optics on why we did well. Oh yeah, it was because I spent X number of hours practicing. But oftentimes those around us have additional perspectives that we can't access. And learning about those perspectives of why we performed poorly, but also why we performed well in the context of these verbs, not labels, is also tremendously beneficial. The other thing that's clear from the literature on growth mindset and stress can enhance performance mindset is that all of that stuff, all those tutorials, are most effective when both teachers and students embrace those mindsets. Now, that's a wonderful situation if teachers and students are available and willing to learn those mindsets. For many of us, we don't have a teacher, we don't have a mentor, we're doing this on our own. And so what's fortunate is that there are also data in the literature showing that under conditions where either the teacher or the mentor is not there or is not embracing a growth mindset where stress enhances the performance mindset, we actually can serve as our own teacher by using a simple tool. And the simple tool that was actually the same tool that was used in one of the Jaeger studies is to take maybe a 3x5 card or an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and write out a letter as if you're writing a letter to the next person coming along trying to get good at the thing that you're trying to get good at, and explain to them what growth mindset is and how it differs from a fixed mindset. Explain to them what the stress enhances performance mindset is, how to adopt it, and how it can amplify performance. That simple exercise of writing a letter, which is essentially to oneself, but you're sort of pretending that the letter is to somebody else, otherwise you could. That simple exercise has been shown to improve one's own performance and to do so in dramatic ways, not just in the immediate term, but also in the future. Now, the final tool I'd like to share is one that I've come up with, but it's one that's really grounded in the neuroscience of neuroplasticity, and believe it or not, it's grounded in our understanding of exercise physiology. And that is to reframe this idea that the mind is like a muscle. I know we hear that over and over again. The mind is like a muscle. You exercise a muscle, it gets stronger. You exercise your mind, you put it through some strain, and you can learn. Those statements are absolutely true, but the statement that the mind is like a muscle, that analogy falls short, I believe, in an important way that can lead a lot of people astray when they try and embrace growth mindset and the stress enhances performance mindset. And the reason I say that is the following. Exercise with weight or resistance training of any kind, whether or not it's body weight, or or free weights, has an incredible property to it in that it increases blood flow to the muscles that we're training. Right? This is something that really distinguishes resistance training from other forms of training like long distance running. When we train our muscles with resistance, the blood flow into that muscle, the so-called pump, gives us a sort of a window of the growth of that muscle that is likely to occur if we allow that muscle to recover after that resistance training. In other words, resistance training provides us a kind of hint of the results we are likely to get. So when we hear the analogy that the mind is like a muscle, I think it falls short because when we strain to learn something with our mind, we don't actually get to feel what it is to perform much better as we are trying to learn that thing. Actually, quite the contrary. In fact, much of what we've been talking about today is the fact that the stress and strain and the disappointment that is so reflexively felt when we look at our diminished performance as we're trying to learn is actually the trigger for invoking the learning itself. So what I'm saying here is that it is not the case that when we go in to learn a language or a new skill or mathematics or something new, that for a moment we are fluent or partially fluent, and then we lose that ability when we walk out of the classroom with a tutorial. That's what makes it different than the gym, where you go and you lift weights or you use resistance training of any kind, and you get this sort of window into, oh, this is what the muscle will feel like and look like when it's larger. So the mind is like a muscle analogy sort of works in the sense that if you properly stress a muscle using resistance training, and then you give it adequate amount of time to recover, it indeed will get bigger and stronger. And it is true that when you go in to try and learn something, if you provide the adequate stress, which is hitting that point where you're not understanding the information, it's not sinking in, and you give yourself some
Enemy remaining.
requires sleep, by the way, then you'll learn that new information over time. But where the mind is like a muscle analogy really falls away, I believe, is that the mind is not like a muscle because you don't actually get to experience the good growth that you're seeking as you're trying to learn. Rather, everything we've been talking about today is about learning how to experience the strain of trying to learn, the agitation of trying to learn as the learning process itself, and understanding that while you might feel back on your heels a little or a lot during that process, that you might, in fact very likely, are going to experience all the category of things that go along with stress, elevated heart rate, frustration, maybe even a little headache or strain, difficulty maintaining focus, etc. That if you understand that all of those things are actually creating the specific neurochemical and neural circuit conditions to invoke learning, well then, that learning will occur. So in some ways, a better analogy would be if it were the case that when you do resistance training, that your muscles actually got smaller during the training and then rebounded to being even bigger than they were prior to the training, that would be the appropriate analogy for the mind is like a muscle. I say all this because, yes, adopting a growth mindset is incredibly valuable. Adopting a stress can enhance performance mindset is incredibly valuable. And even more valuable is combining those two mindsets because they do indeed improve performance in the system. However, none of this process is expected to be reflexive for most people, perhaps for anybody, and the process of building up these mindsets involves another mindset, which is the one that umbrellas them all, or gathers them all together and makes them really work, which is the idea that mindsets are indeed powerful, that they can have a real effect, and that while they do take time to cultivate, they can be cultivated. Thank you for joining me today for our discussion about growth mindset, what it is, and how to cultivate a growth mindset, as well as the related stress can enhance performance mindset, which can also be cultivated. If you're learning from and are enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a terrific zero-cost way to support us. In addition, please subscribe to the podcast on both Spotify and Apple. And on both Spotify and Apple, you can leave us to a 5-star rating. If you have questions for me or comments about the podcast or guests that we want to podcast, please put those in the comment section on YouTube. I do read all the comments. In addition, please check out the sponsors mentioned at the beginning and throughout today's episode. That's the best way to support this podcast. Not so much in today's episode, but in many previous.
The realities of modern life make it tougher than ever to maintain a healthy diet. AG1 gives you high-quality daily nutrition that helps fill nutrient gaps.
Get out of my way!
Welcome to the Huberman Lab podcast, where we discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life.
Enemy spotted. Feeling fence. Spike planted. One enemy remaining.
Diffuse the spike.
Welcome to the Huberman Lab podcast, where we discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life. I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today we're discussing mental training and visualization. Mental training and visualization is a fascinating process that has been shown over and over again in now hundreds of studies to improve our ability to learn anything. When I say anything, I mean the ability to learn music, the ability to learn and perform mathematics, the ability to learn and perform motor skills in sport, in dance, across essentially all domains. The other incredible thing about mental training and visualization is that you'll soon see when you go into the literature, that is the scientific studies on mental training and visualization, you quickly realize that it does not take a lot of mental training and visualization in order to get better at anything. However, that mental training and visualization has to be performed in a very specific way. Today we will discuss exactly how to do mental training and visualization in the specific ways that allow it to complement the actual performance of a motor or cognitive skill to allow you to learn more quickly and to consolidate, that is to keep that information in mind and body so that you can perform those cognitive tasks, music tasks, motor tasks, etc. for long periods of time without ever learning. All of mental training and visualization relies on what I consider really the holy grail of our brain and nervous system, and that's neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is our nervous system, which of course includes the brain, the spinal cord, and all the connections between the brain and spinal cord and the organs and tissues of the body, and then all the neural connections back from the organs and tissues of the body to the brain and spinal cord, and the whole thing in both directions, has the ability to change in response to experience in ways that are adaptive. That is, that allows us to do things that we could not do before, and by doing those things, or by being able to perform those mental operations, we can do better in the world that we live in. We can perform new tasks, we can think new thoughts, we can come up with novel solutions to pre-existing problems that before really vexed us and that we couldn't overcome. All of that is considered neuroplasticity. So today what I'm going to cover is a brief summary of what neuroplasticity is, that is how it occurs in the brain and body. This is extremely important to understand if you're going to use mental training and visualization. Then I'm going to talk about what happens in our brain and body when we do mental visualization in a dedicated way. Many people have heard, perhaps, that when you imagine something happening, that your brain doesn't know the difference between that imagination of the thing happening and the real thing happening. Turns out that is not true. It is simply not true. However, there is somewhat of an equivalence between a real experience and an imagined experience. And we'll talk about the difference between those and how that can be leveraged in order to get the most out of mental training and visualization. Then I will cover exactly which types of mental training and visualization work best across all domains, meaning music learning, mathematics, solving puzzles, motor learning, sports performance, etc., to really allow you a template in which you can plug in or designate what you're going to do each day for a brief period of time in order to accelerate your learning in whatever you choose. And then I'm going to go into a bit of what happens in the brains of different types of people. These different types of people that I'm referring to are people who have more or less of a natural ability to imagine things and visualize them. Because it turns out that we vary tremendously from one individual to the next in terms of our ability to mentally visualize and imagine things and our ability to get better at that over time. And the good news is anyone can get better at mental training and visualization in ways that can serve you well. I'll also briefly touch on the fact that certain people, particularly people on the autism spectrum, as well as people with synesthesias, which is the combining of different perceptual experiences. So you may be one of these people, or you may have heard of people that, for instance, when they think of a number, they also just naturally, spontaneously think of a color, and vice versa. Talk about how that relates to mental imagery and visualization and the creative process and problem solving in general. And then finally, what I'll do is I'll recap mental training and visualization from the standpoint of how best to apply mental training and visualization according to specific challenges. Things like challenges with public speaking, or challenges with sports performance, or challenges with test-taking performance, challenges with essentially anything that will allow you to build specific mental training and visualization practices that are brief, that are supported by neuroscience studies, and that are highly effective. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Our first sponsor is Element. Elements is an electrolyte drink that has everything you need, meaning sodium, magnesium, and potassium, but nothing that you don't, meaning no sugar. It has the sodium, magnesium, potassium in the ideal ratios for hydrating and providing electrolytes to the cells and tissues of your body. So I use Element in my water when I wake up. I like to hydrate right away, so I'll have an Element packet in about 16 to 32 ounces of water when I wake up. I tend to do the same while I exercise, which I typically do in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon, and I'll drink another one throughout the day. The great thing about Element is it also tastes terrific. I particularly like the watermelon flavor, but frankly, I like all the flavors, just mixed into, again, about 16 to 32 ounces of water. If you'd like to try Element, you can go to drinkelement.com/Huberman to claim a free Element sample pack with your purchase. Again, that's drinkelement.com/Huberman. Today's episode is also brought to us by Maui Nui Venison, which I can confidently say is the most nutrient-dense and delicious. The sorts of changes that happen in one's nervous...
Stick to your roles and we'll crush it.
Let's talk about mental training and visualization. Perhaps surprisingly, mental training and visualization has been studied since the late 1800s. There's actually a paper published in 1880 by Galpin called The Statistics of Mental Imagery. Long ago, people were quantifying and trying to understand how is it that people come up with mental images and how they can apply that to learning things more quickly and more stably over time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, mental training and visualization relies on a process that we call neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is a term that many people have heard, and it encompasses many different things. So broadly speaking, neuroplasticity includes developmental plasticity, which is the sort of plasticity that occurs between about birth and age 25. And that can be summarized very easily as passive plasticity. In other words, the sorts of changes that happen in one's nervous system simply by engaging in the world and experiencing life as a child, as a young adult, as an adolescent, and as a 22, 23, 24-year-old, etc. Now, of course, it is not the case that on your 25th birthday, you close out passive neuroplasticity, other type of neuroplasticity, adult neuroplasticity. It's a gradual tapering off of adult neuroplasticity that occurs between age 0 and 25. For some people, 26, for other people, 23. When we say 25, we're really just talking about the average age in which passive plasticity tapers off. However, starting fairly early in adolescence and extending all the way out into 180s, 90s, 100s, not that long, is the other form of neuroplasticity, which is adult neuroplasticity. Adult neuroplasticity is very different than developmental plasticity because it is the sort of plasticity that one can direct towards one's own specific desired learning. So if we wanted to get a little bit more clarity, for sake of confusion, we would say adult plasticity is really about self-directed adaptive plasticity. The reason we call it that as opposed to something else, adult plasticity, is that there are many different forms of neuroplasticity. There is, for instance, maladaptive neuroplasticity that occurs if one gets a really hard head hit and concussion. There will be changes to the brain and nervous system, but those changes to the brain and nervous system do not allow it to perform better. In fact, it often impairs the brain and nervous system's ability to function, and therefore is So I don't want to get overly wordy with a number of different terms here, but I do think it's important to understand that we have developmental plasticity, again, in which the brain nervous system changes simply in response to experiencing specific things, for better or worse. And there's adult self-directed adaptive plasticity, in which one can direct specific changes in terms of learning things cognitively, or learning things in terms of motor function, sport, dance, etc., or a combination of the two. Just to really clarify what I mean by developmental versus self-directed adaptive plasticity, I mentioned that self-directed adaptive plasticity actually can start in adolescence, even though there's ongoing developmental plasticity. I mean, let's be really direct. The brain of a 14-year-old is very different than the brain of that same individual when that person is 21, because there's ongoing developmental plasticity. However, starting at about adolescence, we can all start to decide what it is that we want to learn and engage in self-directed adaptive plasticity. Now, the way to engage self-directed adaptive plasticity, regardless of whether or not you're a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, or you're a 90-year-old, or anywhere in between, is that it requires two things. First thing it requires is focused, dedicated attention to the thing that you're trying to learn.
One enemy remaining.
That actually triggers a number of different chemical and electrical processes in the brain that are often associated with agitation and frustration. And believe it or not, the agitation and frustration is a reflection of the release of specific chemicals, in particular norepinephrine and epinephrine, also called noradrenaline and adrenaline in the brain and body, that creates this discomfort and this heightened level of alertness and attention that many of us don't like and tend to back away from. But it is exactly that chemical, or I should say neurochemical milieu, which signals to the neurons, the nerve cells in the brain and elsewhere in the body, that something needs to change. Think about it. If you can do something perfectly, or if you try and do something and it doesn't cause any neurochemical change in your brain and body, well then, there's no reason for your brain and its connections with the body to change.
30 seconds left.
Okay, so you need focused, dedicated attention to the thing that you're trying to learn. It's often accompanied by agitation, frustration, etc. So that's perfectly normal. In fact, that's a signal that things are going right, meaning they're headed towards learning. But there's a second component that's really required for self-directed adaptive plasticity, and that's periods of deep rest, in particular a good night's sleep, in particular on the night that follows that focused attention to the thing you're trying to learn. There are now hundreds of studies in both animal models and in humans showing that it is really during sleep and other states of deep relaxation, like meditation and non-sleep rest, before on this podcast, but really during our neural that the rewiring of neural connections, that is, the actual neuroplasticity takes place. So the verb neuroplasticity, the rearrangement of connections between neurons, really occurs during sleep, in particular on the first night following an attempt to learn something through this focused attention. Now, developmental plasticity, which is passive, also requires good sleep. It's slightly different. Frankly, it's a lot different in terms of the underlying mechanisms than self-directed adaptive plasticity. But because today we're mainly talking about how to learn faster through mental training and visualization, and that really maps more to self-directed adaptive plasticity, just really want to emphasize this two-step process. There has to be focused, dedicated attention, and then there needs to be sleep. And in particular, sleep on the first night following that training. Now, should you have the unfortunate experience of getting woken up in the middle of the night following trying to learn something, or should you simply not be able to sleep for whatever reason on the night following a bout of learning or an attempt to learn, do not despair, because it turns out that there are what are called second and third night effects also. Once you sleep, you will learn. Those neuroplastic events, the reordering of connections that we call synapses, and the changes that occur in neural circuits that reflects what we call self-directed adaptive plasticity, that still will occur. But ideally, you got a great night's sleep on the first night following trying to learn, and the second night.
Bro, just watch.
Now, there are a few other things that are critical to understand about self-directed adaptive plasticity that will become especially important when thinking about protocols for developing the ideal mental training and visualization process. And that is that there are different forms of plasticity that occur between neurons, although the two main forms are what are called long-term potentiation and long-term depression. I just want to clear you up right now that the word depression is a very loaded word, because the moment people hear the word depression, they think, oh no, that's bad. But in the case of neuroplasticity, long-term depression is simply a change in the connections between neurons and the excitability between neurons that in many ways can be excellent for learning things, in particular motor skills. And we'll get into this in more detail in a little bit, but it turns out that a lot of our ability to get better at some sort of motor skill involves this thing that we call long-term depression. And that's because much of what is happening when we learn a new motor skill is that we are depressing or suppressing specific actions in order to generate a very specific coordinated action. Some of the best examples of long-term depression can actually be borrowed from developmental plasticity. So for instance, if you've ever sat across from an infant who is trying to eat their meal, so imagine a 1.5-year-old or a 2-year-old trying to eat some noodles or some soup or any kind of baby suitable food with a spoon, and they're holding the spoon, or they're trying to hold the spoon, and you'll notice is that their motor movements are terribly uncoordinated. They often will take that spoon to their cheek, to their eye, or to their head. We've all seen these very amusing photos of babies with bowls of food on their head, or with food all over their face, or just everywhere. It appears that they're basically getting the food everywhere. which is in their mouth. And that's because their motor movements are not very well coordinated at that age, and they're not very well coordinated, not because they lack sufficient numbers of neural connections, synapses between neurons, but rather because they have too many connections between too many different neurons.
Switching
The
sides.
neural circuits that control very dedicated, coordinated movement are not there yet. Instead, too many neurons are connected to too many other neurons, and so they can't generate the precise movements that are required in order to get that spoon to their mouth. Now, over time, they get better at moving the utensil to their mouth, such that hopefully by about age 5 or 6, they are eating, in a relatively cleaner way, and hopefully by the time they're 10 or 11 or 12, they're getting the food into their mouth and not all over their face. And people learn this to varying degrees. All you have to do is go to a restaurant and watch how people eat, and you will see a vast variation in people's coordinated movements with utensils. But in general, there's a theme. The younger the person, the more uncoordinated their movement of utensils, and as they get older, the more coordinated. Now, of course, in people that are very old, they have challenges moving objects and their limbs in very smooth ways, and that has to do with a topic that we'll get into when we talk about age-related cognitive decline and motor-related dementias. But for sake of today's discussion, if you just want to think about what happens with long-term depression and the development of a motor skill, both as a baby, as an adolescent, and as an adult who's trying to learn a new motor skill, is that you are eliminating incorrect movements. And when you are eliminating incorrect movements to arrive at only the correct movements in a very reflexive and repeated way, your golf swing, your tennis serve, your volleyball, a child learning to crawl and then walk, think a child learning to eat with utensils, an example I gave before, what's happening in all of those cases is that yes, certain connections in the brain are being strengthened, or what we call potentiated. They are undergoing long-term potentiation, the so-called fire together, wire together mantra that was popularized by the great neurobiologist Dr. Carla Schatz, my colleague at Stanford. But in addition to that, long-term depression, the quieting or the silencing of specific synapses, that is connections between neurons, is absolutely critical for motor skill learning. So we have LTP, long-term potentiation, and LTD, long-term depression, is every bit as important as LTP, long-term potentiation, for getting better at some sort of motor skill, and indeed at getting better at some sort of cognitive skill. Now, as we hear this, this should be intuitive to all of us. If you look at somebody's attempt to learn a particular dance step, or at somebody's attempt to do a tennis serve the first time, it's all over the place. Now, it's not perhaps all over the place in that they're doing a jumping jack while trying to serve the tennis ball, but they're generally arcing the racket too widely on one trial, and then they're arcing it too close to their body on the next trial. So if we were to draw a line over each one of those trials, we would see that there were lines everywhere over time. Whereas once they, quote-unquote, perfect the tennis
Bro,
directly over the line,
what the hell would you smoke it like that? Now we can't see the cross. Like an idiot. Smoke on my ping like I fucking pinged it for. Like, why do you think I pinged it there?
Body to allow that very narrow, coordinated, and directed movement. The same is true for learning anything in the cognitive domain. Even if you want to learn a language, it's not, of course, the case that you know every word in that language and then you simply remove certain words and arrive at the correct sentence structure.
Omen, use your flash. Why are you just baiting him?
You have to suppress
Holy
native
shit,
language.
do
Or if you're a
something.
young child, you have to suppress the generation of just kind of random babbling sounds. Turns out babbling isn't random at all. But the point is that you have to suppress the enunciation of particular sounds and direct the pronunciation of other sounds in order to generate that new language or your ability to speak at all. Okay, so we can really think about neuroplasticity as both a building up process in which you increase connections, so-called long-term potentiation, and a sculpting down or a removal of connections process that we're going to call long-term depression. Now, I have to acknowledge that there are other parts of neuroplasticity too. There are probably some aficionados listening to this who will be shouting back in whatever device it is coming out. Wait, what about spike timing dependent plasticity, or what about paired pulse facilitation?
You are so asshole,
There are
man.
multiple forms of communication between neurons that can strengthen those connections or weaken those connections. But for today's discussion, we just broadly want to think about long-term potentiation and long-term depression because it captures the two most important themes related to mental training and visualization, which is that when we perform a given cognitive or physical task in the real world, so we actually try the dance step or the tennis serve, or when we actually try a math problem, or we try and learn some specific knowledge and write it down and remember it, that is engaging particular neurons, right? They're firing, they're releasing chemicals, but it is also actively suppressing the activity of other neurons. And we are always completely unaware of the ways in which our brain is suppressing certain activity. Okay, so today we have to keep in mind that where there is strengthening of connections, there is also weakening of connections. And when it comes to mental training and visualization, and here's the really key point, with mental training and visualization, you are capturing both processes, both the potentiation, that is the building up and strengthening of connections, and the weakening of the connections that are inappropriate for the thing you're trying to learn. And there are different aspects of mental training and visualization protocols that really harness the potentiation versus the depression aspect. And today we will cover mental training and visualization protocols that capture both the potentiation and the depression aspect of neuroplasticity, and in that way serve as an augment, that is a complement to the actual real world cognitive and physical training that you're doing. Because I'll just give this away right now. Turns out that mental training and visualization is not a replacement for real world cognitive or motor behavior. Again, mental training and visualization cannot replace real world execution of cognitive tasks or of motor tasks if you want to learn. However, mental training and visualization can and has been shown to be effective for greatly enhancing the speed at which you learn and the stability of that learning over time.
Oh my God.